welcome back everybody to some more decathlon art. And today we're going to kind of start to get into the thick of art fundamentals. Definitely the toughest part, simply because of the number of people and years and artworks we need to know. And that, of course, is the Renaissance. So today we're just going to cover the Renaissance in Southern Europe. We might even have to break this into two videos. We'll see kind of where we're at by the end of this, but because there is a lot to talk about here. Okay. And so the first thing to really talk about is kind of the transition from medieval period to the Renaissance. They kind of talk of they're kind of hemming and hawing about how it's not super clear cut usually, right? But the kind of transitional artist, right, that we need to know that transitions us from the medieval period into the Renaissance, artistically speaking, is Giotto di Bondone, usually just known as Giotto. And he lives from 1267 to either 1336 or 37. Okay. And so he is best known for his frescoes. Frescoes, again, are painted onto wet walls, right, using some form of plaster. And we'll talk about that type of development here. But one of his most important developments is the use of simple perspective, right, or the concept of perspective at all, right? And so simple perspective is simply this idea of kind of overlapping figures, right? So overlapping figures and then modeling figures in the round, which basically means kind of creating almost a 3D perspective, right? And so what this does is it creates an illusion of a staging for his figures, almost able to look into the event itself, right? And then he also had one thing that really separates him from the medieval artists, right? One of the many things that kind of transitions him from medieval to Renaissance is the kind of use of expression and emotion, gestures and emotional expression. Gestures and emotional expression that he gives his characters in his art, right? Okay, so yeah, they kind of talk about beforehand, right? It was previously kind of flat and unexpressive figures. And let's take a look at one of those paintings of his. Okay, so this is a fresco of Giotto's, as you can see here. So the simple perspective is really the concept of these. You have figures in the background who are less clear, whether through being obstructed by figures in the foreground or being smaller, right? Or not necessarily smaller, but certainly more concealed. I wouldn't say they're smaller per se. You can see up here as well, right? Kind of creating a stage, a set, right, for these actors to be playing a role in, right? So that's kind of what the major innovation of Giotto's is, which of course blends us right into the Renaissance. Okay. And so I guess before we get into the art itself, right, we see economic change kind of leads to the Renaissance. Okay. In particular, they talk about two things, right? They talk about the development of paper money, which went along with the printing press of Johannes Gutenberg, which helped trade quite significantly. And then also we see the fortunes of wealthy patrons, especially the Medici family, who were basically the rulers of Florence at this point. And they would become patrons of the arts, right? Another is the examples of Greek and Roman art and architecture, of Greek and Roman art in Italy in particular, right, which is going to allow them to kind of find those influences a lot quicker, right? Okay. So yeah. And what we see here during this era is more of a focus on individual artists rather than movements, as we're going to see with the kind of just growing amount of individual artists we are going to talk about. Um, and of course, we talked very, very early on about the writings of, um, is it Andreas Vesalius, right? Giorgio Vasari, right? Who started to kind of gather the biographies of these artists, right, in the lives of the artists, right? Um, and so we see that, and a large reason of this is the focus on the individual, right, within society, right, not just within art, right. The emphasis on the individual, which we tend to call humanism, which they didn't bring up the term humanism, but it might be good to just understand because that is a kind of key philosophical component of the Renaissance, right? But on top of that, the kind of concept of the Renaissance man, right? This kind of miraculous artist, or not just artist, right? But a kind of all around person, which really defines great art or thought during the time period, right? Um, and so, before this, we had before the Renaissance, right? We saw artists as artisans, right? Basically, just um, you know, people working on stuff, but not necessarily considered like having a unique skill or a very unique skill that can be profitable, right? Um, and so we start to see artists as intellectual figures, right? As these kind of geniuses that need to be talked to and talked about, rather than just kind of used for other purposes, right? Um, and so one of the key events for the beginning of the Renaissance is a competition in Florence to design the doors of the city's new baptistry. A baptistry being a place where people are baptized, right? Okay, so in Florence we got the competition for the baptistry doors, which occurs in the year 1401. Right, so really the 1400s is the beginning um, of the Renaissance, and the winner was a artist by the name of Lorenzo Ghiberti, who will live from 1381 possibly until 1455. Okay, and he uses a kind of Greek style. Oh, okay. F8. Uh, oh, there we go. He uses a Greek kind of style panel door, um, in which depicts the sacrifice of Isaac, which Isaac appears as a kind of Greek figure. Okay. I do not have a picture of this because there's something else I would rather have a picture of. So he wins this contest. He designs this door, and then he is also asked to make he's asked to make doors for the Cathedral of Florence. And then which takes him 25 years to make, which is a pretty long time. And they are coined the Gifts of Paradise, the Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo. Right. Which we'll obviously come to Michelangelo here a little bit later. And that's kind of their name at this point. Okay. And let's take a look at those Gates of Paradise, as you can see here. Okay. Without getting too pixelated here, you see some scenes from the Bible here on these gates, but it looks gold. I can't tell you if it's gold plated or actual gold, but these relief carvings right into these doors are pretty magnificent, and kind of attest to why it's called the Gates of Paradise. Okay. All right. So the second place winner of this competition for the baptistry doors was a guy by the name of Filippo Brunelleschi. who is, despite coming second place in this particular contest, is quite possibly the father of the Renaissance for a couple reasons. Filippo Brunelleschi, who will live from 1377 to 1466. Sorry, 1446. That makes a little more sense, right? 1446. He ends up focusing on architecture after losing this contest, which is a shame, right? Like, he's probably pretty good at what he did. And he wins a different contest to create the dome for the Cathedral of Florence. So the Cathedral of Florence roof had not existed for quite a while, right? Because the architects of the time had a very hard time constructing a vault that was big enough to span the large space that was required, right? And so what Brunelleschi did is he created a double-shelled dome, basically having a dome on top of a dome. And so that would be emulated by later artists, as you can see here, right? So there's this outer dome, and within that is an interior dome to kind of help support the outer dome, right? And so very famous dome of the Cathedral of Florence. Okay, but what the crucial thing that Brunelleschi did that really brings painting in particular, Renaissance painting, creates this whole new style known as linear perspective, which they also point out as called single vanishing point perspective. Okay, so very briefly, what linear perspective is, right, is in a painting, right, if you create a horizon line, right, basically where the horizon is in the painting, right, what you should see then is that the objects in the back should disappear into that horizon line, and in particular creating one vanishing point along that horizon line, right? So let's say if I'm, as you can see here, right, maybe making a road, right, our eye will see that road disappear upon the horizon, right? And so what you'll also see then is figures in the front will appear bigger than characters in the back, even though those characters are the same size, right? And even further on, right? And so that is linear perspective, right? That is what our eye sees the actual world as, right? So what this allows for is a lot more natural looking painting, right? And so the man to put that into practice is a guy by the name of Masaccio. So Brunelleschi's was purely like theoretical, right? He didn't make any paintings of this, right? Or using this style, right? Masaccio is the first to utilize it. A very young man, dies young, right? But he's the first to utilize it in art, right? And then he also utilized both linear and aerial perspective. Aerial perspective being more of a top-down view. You see a lot of aerial perspective, in the paintings of China of the Tang and Song dynasty as well. In frescoes, he used frescoes as well. Frescoes are a very, very important style of art at the time. I don't know if I have any Masaccios. I do not. All right, moving on to our next Renaissance artist. And this is kind of the early Renaissance still, but a very important artist is Donatello. And if you might be saying to yourself, hey, that's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, well, all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are named after Renaissance artists. So he lives from 1389 theoretically to 1466. So don't get that confused with Brunelleschi, who lasts from 46. Donatello is to 66. Okay, and he's considered the founder of modern sculpture. Okay. The big influence, there's a very clear influence on him in classical antiquity. Sorry. Classical antiquity, very influenced on him, especially very clear in his bronze David, okay, which he made between the 1420s to the 1460s. Okay, and here is that sculpture of David, not to be confused with Michelangelo's marble David, which is probably the more famous one at this point, right? But this is the first known freestanding nude sculpture since the Greek and Romans. The first known freestanding nude sculpture since the time of the Greek and Romans. So freestanding means it's not in relief. Nude sculpture since the Greeks and the Romans. Right. And so we start to see as his life goes on, he will start to have more naturalist sculpture and focus on the kind of expression of character and dramatic action. As you see in the David, he's not necessarily very expressive. He's just kind of posing. He's posing, and he's posing in that classical form, right, with the kind of knee, his weight all shifted onto one knee in kind of a natural pose, and very human looking, right? Very similar to that antiquity, that classical art that we've talked about. Okay, so later on, a generation later, they say, we have the artist Botticelli. And Botticelli, who lives from possibly 1444 to 1510, is most well known for his work, The Birth of Venus. Okay, so The Birth of Venus, he created around 1482. That's what the C means circa, which means around, which establishes the image of female beauty for centuries for art, really until the 1900s or so. And so we have kind of the description, right? We have a long-necked Venus, right? The goddess Venus. We have a languid pose. What does languid mean, you might ask? Frankly, I'm going to have to look it up because I need to make sure I get it right. Languid. Nope, not languish. Languid. Displaying or having a disinclination for physical exertion, slow and relaxed. So not necessarily kind of just chilling, right, vibing. And then flowing hair. Okay. And this is also one of the first paintings of a full-length nude female since antiquity. And you can see that painting here, right? You've probably seen this painting before, but that is supposed to be displaying the birth of Venus, right? And so that is the last of kind of the low Renaissance, I guess, the early Renaissance, right? And next we're getting into the high Renaissance, right? The kind of high point of the Renaissance. Okay, and we have quite a few artists that you probably know from this era, but also quite a few you probably don't, right? And the two, of course, that we want to focus on the most is Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti. But nobody calls him by his full name, right? It's always just Michelangelo. Leonardo da Vinci lives from 1452 to 1519. So, which, makes me think Botticelli should probably be considered part of this generation as well, but maybe not. And then Michelangelo from 1475 to 1564. He lives a very long life. And these two are the model for the term Renaissance man. Right? This kind of idea of not just being an artist, but being kind of a jack of all trades. They talk about all the things that Da Vinci is known as, right? Let me try to squeeze it down here. He is an inventor. He is a sculptor. He is a scientist. He is, I'm not even doing this in order, I'm sorry. And he is an architect, an engineer, a painter, and a musician. So he kind of does it all. Again, Renaissance man, which is, again, a very European concept, because what we've actually seen in China for a very long time, that the bureaucrats of the Chinese government are expected to be all of these things as well, pretty much, right? Not necessarily inventors or sculptors, but certainly artists, right, of some kind, usually through poetry and landscape painting, right? That's kind of what they're supposed to do in their off time. They talk about his design for locked canals. Uh, uh, his design for locks on canals is used today. Right, basically a series of locks that, like, you move a boat in, you lock it, you kind of make sure that you change the water level of that part to make sure it's the same as the water level of the next part. Right, they talk about his drawings of submarines and helicopters being like possible, right? Right, viable, they say, right? But two paintings of his we obviously need to know about. I'm going to kind of stretch it out to here. Okay, two of his paintings are going to be the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. Again, two paintings you've probably heard of. Certainly the Mona Lisa, maybe probably the Last Supper, 1495 and 1498, and this one from 1503 to 1505 is when he made them. Right? They are, again, are icons of popular culture, as they pointed out. And so his key innovation within painting is the concept of sfumato. So what is sfumato? Is the use of kind of mellowed colors and a blurred outline, which comes from the Italian word fumo, or smoke. Right, so it kind of gives this almost smoky appearance, right, and allows forms to blend pretty easily without real perceptible transitions, right? Allows forms to blend. Okay, let's take a look at those right now. Okay, so here again we see this is actually a nice comparison point, right? Because here we have kind of the Birth of Venus, a very clean painting. Here we have the Last Supper, which granted is not in great condition, so it's kind of hard to see here, and it's not necessarily visible, but again, also we do see linear perspective, right? In fact, you can kind of see some nature outside, right? But this one has this this very interesting, focus on Jesus. But Mona Lisa, right? Again, probably the more famous one. It's almost just hazy, right? It's kind of got this this. It looks like you're looking at it through a fog, right? That she is really almost out of focus in a way, and then of course the linear perspective in the back. But that is the Mona Lisa. That is the use of sfumato, right? She almost looks soft, right? She doesn't look like she's necessarily like human in a way, almost glowing because of that use of sfumato, right? Okay, all right. So now we're going to move Michelangelo to the top here. And he is at the same time working on these piece that will kind of establish him as the powerful artist and Renaissance man that we know. By the way, most of these guys, if not all of them, are living in Florence, right? And so the city of Florence, right? Okay. So Florence holds a competition to basically they get this big old chunk of marble that was flawed. A competition for a statue from flawed marble. Right, so they're probably going to use it for construction purposes, build a marble building of some sort. But since that wasn't going to happen due to the flaws within the marble structure, or the raw marble that they got, they decided they were going to instead make a sculpture out of it, which means you don't have to use all the marble, which means you can kind of get away with not using the flawed part, right? And so it had a very large crack in the middle, and so Michelangelo wins this and turns it into his most famous sculpture by far, probably almost on par with the famous Mona Lisa, this marble sculpture of David, which he does in 1504, again a year after the Mona Lisa, or a year after he begins the Mona Lisa. And you can see the David right here. Yeah. It's very large, by the way. You can't tell, but it's a massive, massive sculpture. And it was, so the reason it is so massive is that it was meant to be put on. It was meant to be put on the facade of the Cathedral of Florence, the same cathedral that we talked about earlier, that Brunelleschi built the dome for, which is why it's so large, because you're going to see it from far away. Okay. And they kind of talk about the three things about it that really are supposed to embody the spirit of Florence. Embody the spirit of Florence as a city, as a republic, right? Florence is a independent city within the Holy Roman Empire. And those three things are going to be, of course, the beautiful carving itself, the smooth texture of the finished marble, and the striking pose of David. Okay. And so Michelangelo, very famous painter and sculptor, but it's usually a painting that comes to mind when we talk about Michelangelo. And so, but let's talk about a little bit more of his kind of his art, or his sculpture career. And so in 1505, Pope Julius II commissions his tomb design for Michelangelo. And for his tomb, Michelangelo sculpts three different sculptures, right? He sculpts a sculpture of Moses. Makes a sculpture of the dying slave. And he makes a sculpture of the bound slave. Okay, he completes these. He takes Moses takes him from 1513 to 1515. The dying slave from 1513 to 1516. So he's working on these concurrently. And then also same with the bound slave, 1513 to 1516. Okay, let's take a look at all three of those very briefly. Here is the sculpture of Moses. Nothing I can really add to it. It's very large. The sculpture of the dying slave, and then lastly, the sculpture of the bound slave. So it looks like these two maybe are supposed to almost flank Moses, quite possibly. Right. And then for unknown reasons, the Pope cancels the commission. And so he's kind of left out to dry. He's, already created these artworks and was going to get money for them and didn't necessarily get paid. So it becomes a great disappointment in Michelangelo's career, right? And then the Pope gives him another commission. And he's much more hesitant about this one, obviously, right? He thinks he'll get canceled. But this commission is to decorate the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Okay, the Sistine Chapel, the main chapel within the Vatican City. And so what's interesting here is that he did the sculptures after the commission was canceled anyways, because he makes those sculptures after the Sistine Chapel, right? Because it takes him from 1508 to 1512 to complete the Sistine Chapel. But again, as you see, these start in 1513. So I guess he went ahead and did them. So a couple things about this, I guess. 700 square yards of ceiling are covered by the paintings of Michelangelo. And then, so they don't really talk too much about what's going on there, because frankly, there's a lot going on in the Sistine Chapel art, which we'll look at here in a bit. But we've also seen the restoration, or it's become much more, gaining a lot more interest as we see restoration to clean the frescoes. Again, the frescoes back, um, uh, which removes the oil and wax and grime that have accumulated over the centuries to make it a little more clear. Right. But we see controversy around the restoration of artwork in general. Right. If you guys remember from a few years ago, there was that kind of lady, this random lady who attempted to restore this portrait of Jesus, and it turned out very poorly. But let's look at that Sistine Chapel. Look at this. This isn't even all of it. It is something to behold. And then the very famous, you can't see it in this picture, but there's the very famous kind of two Jesus and man touching, or God and man touching fingers, right? Or almost touching fingers, right? There is part of this as well, right? So yeah, just a truly monumental piece of art. The Sistine Chapel is done by Michelangelo. Okay. So we got some other artists, but I'm going to come back and finish those here in a second. So I will be back shortly. All right, so let's continue on with our discussion of the Renaissance. Hopefully we can get everything onto this sheet, although I'm not feeling super confident about that idea. But we're going to continue on with our high Renaissance painters. And the high Renaissance painter we want to focus on now is another one of our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Raphael Sanzio, which typically, of course, he just goes by Raphael, who lives from 1483 to 1520. Another pretty short life of the Renaissance artists. And so he's brought to Rome from a pretty early age. And while there, he is commissioned by the Pope, Julius II. Oops. Okay. And he starts to learn from Michelangelo, his kind of commission rival. But him and Michelangelo are very different. Michelangelo more of a kind of individual artist, right? Whereas Raphael employs numerous assistants. He uses lots of assistants, especially to adorn the Pope's chambers, to adorn with frescoes, chambers with frescoes, which is interesting. That one of the most famous of these frescoes, probably his most famous artwork, the School of Athens, is in the Pope's chambers, because the School of Athens is actually a pretty secular piece of art, right? 1508 to 1511. Okay. It's a secular piece of art celebrating Greek philosophers and scientists, right? And then also on top of that, another piece of art he creates is the Sistine Madonna, which he makes from 1513 to 1514. Man, the early 1500s were just popping off for the Renaissance. Right, and creates an enduring image of the Virgin Mary. He's kind of considered the master of the depictions of the Virgin Mary. Right, the painting of the Madonna, which is the Virgin Mary, right, the mother of Jesus. And let's take a look at some of these artworks. Here's the School of Athens. Again, the linear perspective and pretty clear view. Very famous artwork here, right? Right, and I believe this is all also designed, right? This is all painted as well, which is pretty magnificent. And then here is one of his famous Sistine Madonna, right? Again, Virgin Mary with Jesus. I cannot tell you who these are. I would possibly assume that's Mary Magdalene, based upon the fact that she's probably the most other famous woman in his life. Who this is, I cannot tell. Possibly Joseph. Joseph would make sense here. Right, the adoptive father of Jesus, right? Okay, So that's in Rome. That also makes me, I believe Michelangelo is also in Rome, right? Which makes sense because he's commissioned by the Pope. But they also talk about the Venetian artists, the artists of Venice, and so I kind of want to highlight them as just the Venetian artists, right? These are less well known, but they are important for your purposes. The first one I'm talking about is Giorgione, who lives from 1477 or 78, whichever one, to 1510. Okay. And he is specifically important in landscape painting. And he doesn't paint the typical he has atypical landscapes or atypical subjects, right? Which is basically not Bible subjects or classical subjects, right? So basically, those have been the two major subjects at the time, is either from the Bible or from classical antiquity, from Greek and Roman, gods and stuff usually. And the painting they want to focus on here is The Tempest, which he makes pretty late in his life, in 1508 or around that time. It is very unique because what we typically have prior to this is that we have kind of the people, the figures as the subject matter, right? The people as the main focus of the art, and not in the landscape, which is kind of like this nice additive part to it. In The Tempest, the landscape is actually the subject, and the people are kind of second hand, right? They're kind of there almost like backdrops for the landscape itself, and kind of create more character for the landscape, right? And we can see that here, right? So again, the landscape very clearly dominating. The people are kind of off into the corners almost, right? But the landscape is what is really drawing your eye in, right? Especially as it's in the middle, especially, right? That's kind of the main thing, is that it's the focus of it, right, is definitely the landscape. Okay. So another famous Venetian artist is Titian. Full name Titian Vicelli, or Vicelli, who lives from 1488 to 1576. Okay. They call him one of the most well-known Venetian painters. He is well known for his portraits of patrons, right? So people will hire him to make portraits of them. Okay. And he is also, they call him the greatest colorist, right? The use of colors in his paintings is considered the best, bar none, within the Renaissance artists, right? And he was very innovative with his portraits, right? He would use, let's see here. He would use elements of a setting, like a column or a curtain, instead of a neutral background, right? So he would use columns. He would use curtains as backdrops, right? So that's very unique of his, right? Instead of using kind of neutral backgrounds. And then we can kind of see that influence quite a long time. Okay. I did not get a painting from Titian, though, unfortunately. Tintoretto is our next Venetian artist, from 1518 to 1594. And he really represents a pretty drastic shift in Renaissance art, which makes sense. He's almost late Renaissance, right? He creates a style, or is linked to a style. Whether he created it or not, I don't think we know, or at least the resource doesn't talk about. Mannerism, right? And so Mannerism grows in popularity, is popular in the late 16th century, right? Again, we're kind of fading out of the Renaissance at this time, right? We're kind of getting away from it a little bit more. And one of the key components of Mannerism, we see a distortion of certain elements, specifically scale and perspective. Okay, we see distortion of scale and perspective. We also see kind of acidic colors, We see acidic colors, not necessarily acidic in the way we think, but certainly just like really bright and almost like off. It feels off. And the twisted positioning of the subjects. Okay. And then, so Tintoretto is not necessarily he didn't use the color schemes, right? He did not use the color schemes in his paintings, but he did kind of use all the rest of the stuff. He would present dramatic angles of his painters or of his subjects. Okay. He would. They talked about using small figures as models, right? So he would kind of look at them in a distorted perspective to help kind of create his artwork, right? And then he also used a technique known as chiaroscuro. Let me make sure I'm spelling it right. Yeah, chiaroscuro, which is the heavy contrast of light and dark. Which you also see in a lot of future paintings, especially with Rembrandt, who was in, of course, last year's topic, right? His later works are really focused on spiritual matter, right? As we're going to see here with our example, our spiritual subjects, right? So kind of focusing on religion, and then he really kind of predicts the Baroque era that comes up next, right? And specifically the sharp perspectives that he has and the chiaroscuro. Sharp perspective being like kind of just weird angles, right? Almost like acute angles, right? Sharp perspectives and the chiaroscuro kind of lead us into the Baroque era of art. Okay, let's take a look at one of his paintings. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I get? Yeah, that's Giorgione. Oh, I did get a Titian. I'm sorry, I did get a Titian indeed. But yeah, I don't know too much about it. I should have probably had a portrait. So we're gonna move on from that one. There we go. So this is a painting of Tintoretto's. So a couple things here. Again, just a very interesting perspective, right? Usually this is the Last Supper, and so like we've seen the Last Supper kind of face on. Especially from Da Vinci, right? But we're seeing this kind of unique perspective from the side at this kind of almost high angle, right? And then we're also seeing a very sharp contrast between our lights and darks here, right? We're not necessarily seeing the weird coloring again. It's not super acidic as we think about with Mannerist painting, right? But he kind of predates Mannerist in a way, or at least heavily influenced it, right? Let's see if I can fit the rest here. We're very close. If I got rid of this, maybe I would have been able to, but that's all right. All right. One of the key events of the era is going to be the Reformation. So this is a political or a religious event. Well, it's everything, right? Where we see criticism of the opulence of the church, right? The church is not supposed to be super wealthy. They're supposed to kind of use that wealth to help people. Right, so we see a lot of criticism of that, right? And so we start to see a move away in reformed areas from the kind of focus on Christian subjects and the richly decorated churches and religious imagery, right? Which means a lot less art from churches, which churches were kind of one of the two major patrons of the arts, as we could see up here with Pope Julius II, right? However, we then have a counter-Reformation, which is the church's response to the Reformation. If you don't know anything about the Reformation, this is Martin Luther, right, creating the Protestant religions. And so the counter-Reformation, in terms of art, really emphasized lavish decoration. So in the places where the counter-Reformation reigns, we see even more decoration. And then one of the artists most closely, not only this lavish church decoration, also dramatic and emotional art. I'm going to have a really tough time. I might have to squeeze this somewhere else. Dramatic and emotional art. And the most famous of the Counter-Reformation artists is Dominicus where does the name go? Dominikos Diotokopoulos, but he is known as the Greek in Spanish, El Greco. And so El Greco is influenced heavily by Tintoretto. Okay, heavily influenced by Tintoretto and his use of chiaroscuro and kind of those Mannerist styles. He worked with Titian. He worked in Titian's workshop for a while. Do we have a time period? No, we do not. Worked in Titian's workshop for a while as well. And then in 1576, he moves to Toledo from Italy. Toledo in Spain. And he is one of the most well-known Mannerist painters. Mannerist painters. And the key thing that he used to capture religious fervor, I'm going to move him up here, is elongated figures, right, to show religious fervor. Right. The religious fervor of the Counter-Reformation, right? And so they talk about El Greco and Tintoretto as kind of the bridge from the Renaissance to the next era, which is going to be the Baroque era. But we're not going to necessarily talk directly about that just yet because we have to go north to the Northern Renaissance, which has a very different style and very different influences or what's considered important, right? But that is the Renaissance in Southern Europe. There is a lot going on. Look at all the key terms here. Look at all the key dates. There is so much going on in the Southern Renaissance, and the Northern Renaissance is going to tack onto that. And then, frankly, until we're done with the Western history arts, it is just a lot of terms, a lot of dates, a lot of key people, right? But we're going to get through it all. We're going to get through it together. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in